Straughan, also known under the nom de plume of Girl Writes What, is a writer, videographer and mother, widely recognised as one of the most prominent female voices in the men's rights movement. She's also one of the founding members of the Honey Badger Brigade, a popular online anti-feminist radio programme. Ladies and gentlemen, Karen Straughan.
All right, everybody sit the F down. Jesus. Get it together, people. It's not like you're me, and you don't have any excuses to be last-minute Lucy's. So, my talk is about stumbling blocks, evolutionary stumbling blocks on the road to men's issues advocacy, on the road to fairness and equality. Basically what I'm going to talk about is the really sticky problems, the really difficult ones that are very, very hard to deal with and get around. When I first stumbled across the men's movement online, one of the first things that strongly pulled me in terms of interest, was the discussion around sex differences between men and women. In terms of interests, preferences, the ways of seeing the world and being in the world, and also relating to oneself and others. I found that all to be extremely fascinating. But it's, and it's become a primary interest of mine, and it has remained very fascinating and intriguing for me to kind of dig deep into all of those things. But at the same time, my feelings about the field of evolutionary psychology are ambivalent, to say the least, because its implications are a tad depressing when you really think about it. Imagine a well-developed field of psychology that tells you exactly how things work and exactly why they work that way, but that gives you no easy solutions. We live in a democratic society, and if a law is unjust, we can change it. We've done it a lot of times. We've done it plenty of times. We've changed laws that discriminated against women, against ethnic minorities, against LGBTQ plus LMNOP people. I'm not making, I am kind of poking fun, but you know, we've eliminated a lot of the discrimination against those groups of people. We would see a law as unjust and we would be motivated to change it. But that's where the problem lies. To be motivated to change something, we must first see it as bad and something else as better. And our sense of justice is based on our perceptions and how our moral intuitions interpret those perceptions. Perception is not always reality. If we don't see a particular law or policy as unjust, or if our moral intuitions conclude that even if it is unjust, changing it would lead to a greater injustice, we aren't motivated to change it. Human beings are very sloppy creatures. We are irrational, emotional, biased, and easily duped, particularly if those attempting to dupe us are manipulating our emotions and exploiting our existing biases. We rarely engage our rational minds. We have this big, giant, beautiful thing on the top of our heads that's been sticky taped and bubblegummed on to all of our reptilian neurostructures. But we really don't use it. When we do, it's most often to back-rationalize decisions we already made through subconscious, intuitive processes. So basically, humans don't use reason to make decisions so much as to justify the decisions we've already made. And that's a big problem for the men's movement. Now, my discovery of evolutionary psychology was kind of like discovering the exact mechanism of a debilitating disease, only to discover that there may be no cure, and that really sucks. But I'm here because I hope there is something we can do about the things that I'm going to talk about. And that even if we can't implement a cure, we might find a course of treatment that can alleviate the worst of the symptoms. And the first step in the process of accurately identifying and describing the problem itself, that is really just investigating what's going on. The second step, right, is getting the information out there so we can find workarounds and devise effective strategies to bring others on board with what we want to see happen. Now, I often talk about the difficulty in countering the sloganeering of feminists. It takes a politician about 11 seconds, if you're Barack Obama, maybe 45, to recite the words, "Women in America make 77 cents on the dollar for every dollar a man makes. Women deserve equal pay for equal work." And it's instantly recognizable. It's easy to understand. It's been a cultural trope for ages. Everyone intuitively gets what it means. And most people, even now, just nod and say, "Damn right, women deserve equal pay." Then you come along and ask them to sit still for 25 minutes or more while you explain in detail, in excruciating, dry, boring detail, why that statement is misleading, and demonstrate to them that women do earn roughly equal pay for equal work. It's boring. You are, in essence, asking them to do work, and more than this, you are asking them to swim upstream. You're not just asking them to learn something. You're asking them to learn something they don't want to learn. You're asking them to disengage their emotions and apply logic while every fiber of their being is screaming at them to stay in the moral outrage zone. Down with this sort of thing. Can't you just let me be outraged at this injustice against women? It makes me feel good. It makes me feel righteous, morally righteous, and like I'm fighting the good fight. And here you MRAs and anti-feminists are vomiting dry, soulless data all over the place and killing my buzz. That's the response you get. So I guess what I'm saying is human beings kind of suck. We think we're these awesome, rational, evolved, moral beings, but we're pretty much kidding ourselves. And perhaps what is most the biggest problem has gotten us into this mess has been the pervasive belief that we are not that we don't suck, that we are somehow elevated, and we are rational and reasonable and fair beings. Biological determinists like myself, and I'm not a biological essentialist, but I do believe biology plays a huge role. We are scorned as bigots, while the social constructionist lunatics run off with the keys to the halls of power and then busy themselves smearing poo all over the walls of academia and flinging it at anyone who challenges them. All while claiming humans are above the base instincts of animals, that we are self-made and infinitely malleable, and then they get pandered to by politicians the world over. So we have a whole bunch of human challenges here. And now that I've got everybody good and depressed, let's explore what they are, because these are the really sticky problems when engaging in this type of work. Now, sexual dimorphism is more than a function of physical size. It affects our behaviors, our attitudes, our approaches to the opposite sex, and our personalities. And it's also reflected in our physical appearance. In terms of something called neoteny, this is demonstrated here, the little baby there. On the left, our skulls in adulthood much more closely resemble that little baby than they do the adult chimpanzee. Individuals low in neoteny are perceived as intimidating, and individuals high in neoteny are perceived as sociable and affiliative and harmless and fuzzy and fluffy and nice. They're just nice. More than this, our sympathies are extremely well triggered by neoteny. The cuteness of babies, for instance, makes you want to be kind to them, or at least not be mean. It's their superpower. It's what keeps them alive when they scream 16 hours a day. And that is one of the most important psychological mechanisms that's been that has adapted in our brains as adults, is that we find babies so unbearably cute that we can't be angry at them, even when they're completely upending our entire lives and you haven't slept in like 36 hours and they're still screaming. So this is how babies make it through their most vulnerable phase of life. This is how parents propagate their genes. Now, both men and women are extremely neotenous compared to chimpanzees or gorillas or any of our close relatives. But in terms of physical neoteny, women have men beat hands down. They absolutely do. Even in terms of neoteny within a given sex, like this, okay, it affects our perceptions of other people. Studies have shown that people find feminized, or one would more correctly say neotenized, which would be the one on the right, those male faces are more trustworthy than the masculinized one on the left. People find them easier to be around, and they don't worry about the guy on the left punching anybody's lights out. But it's worse than that. Women's higher average neoteny is not just a cause of unequal treatment, it's also a symptom of unequal treatment. Women evolved to be cuter than men, and if that's the case, then being cute really works for women. And in order for something to become adaptive, it has to help you do one of two things. It has to help you survive long enough to reproduce, or it has to help you secure a mate and propagate your genes. For women, neoteny is a multi-purpose adaptation. According to one cross-cultural survey of men, women high in neoteny were not only perceived as more sociable, they were rated as more sexually attractive. And this is across cultures. So it works really well for women for a reason, and that reason is because of gynocentrism. And gynocentrism is exactly what it sounds like. Women and their children form the center of human societies, and because of women's role in reproduction, human societies have always altered this at their peril. The society that treated female life as inherently expendable did not survive. And I don't think I need to explain to anybody here what the inherent calculation of that is. So we're just going to essentially move on. But in terms of sex differences in reproductive strategies, it also plays a role. In a tournament mating system, the system used by all the other great apes and a whole lot of mammals out there, all the females have access to sex and reproductive opportunities. And the difference between a successful female and an unsuccessful one is going to be the difference between having 6 kids and only 4. But for males, the difference looks more like this. It really, one male can monopolize the reproductive potential of numerous females and edge all of the other guys out. Both males and females of all social species compete with their same-sex peers for social dominance. We don't tend to look at this too much in women, but it absolutely exists. In mammals, male intrasexual competition is a competition for mating opportunities. Female intrasexual competition is more accurately described as a competition for resources. And they result in these intrasexual dominance hierarchies. We are a unique species, however, Unlike, say, chimpanzees, male dominance hierarchies aren't only about who is biggest, toughest, or most willing to throw down when challenged. They're also about the acquisition of resources and the transfer of those resources to females. They're also about leadership rather than merely being a thug. And the realities, this is because the realities of getting food in a nutrient-poor environment where most of it walked on legs and was capable of killing you, that required males to work cooperatively just to eat. And it also required the dominant males to reward their voluntary helpers with a fair share of the take. If you weren't fair, your guys would go to someone who was. It also meant that if males weren't sharing food with females, the females simply weren't going to eat. Dominant males had to share with subordinates to ensure their continued cooperation. And once they'd done so, there just wasn't enough left, even in that top alpha guy's hands, to maintain a huge harem. Subordinate males were offered a unique opportunity to capitalize on their ability and willingness to provision a single favored female. And that's kind of how this whole human experiment got started. The environment also selected for intelligence. It takes a lot more brain to stalk a gazelle than to stalk a mango. It takes much more brain to coordinate the efforts of several individuals of relatively small stature without a lot in the way of built-in weaponry. We didn't have huge fangs. We didn't have claws. We weren't very fast. We were pretty pathetic, really. In bringing down a large animal and dealing with a large predator when you're in a grassland rather than in the trees. When human women compete with other women for men, they are actually competing for resources. I mean, they're competing for other things, but the primary one is resources. Because unlike with other great apes, our reproductive model involves men providing women and children with resources rather than women fending for themselves. Every other single great ape, all of our closest primate relatives, all of the mothers are single mothers. This way of doing things, men acquiring resources and sharing them with women and children in return for reproductive opportunities, is one of the primary reasons we have been so incredibly successful. And our way of doing it is an unprecedented social innovation. Among other primates that practice monogamy and male provisioning of offspring, only the socially dominant pair has any mating rights whatsoever, and they will aggressively police the other members of the group to prevent them from mating. But we humans, we're the only primates who couple monogamously and have no hard and fast rules as to who gets to pair up. And if you can manage to attract a mate, then you get to have one. And for men, one way to attract a partner has always been to show that he can provide for her. This is at least my quick and dirty hypothesis of how we found ourselves within this very, very unique paradigm of sociosexual organization. And we also need to consider it, the challenges that caused this form of organization also led to another uniquely human characteristic. For other animals like these bees here, group cooperation is limited by kinship. You have one queen bee, one ovary, she lays all the eggs, and everybody else are brothers and sisters. Let's consider in contrast our chimpanzee cousins who live in multi-male, multi-female groups of up to 120 individuals. Oh my goodness. The males tolerate each other because they're all genetically related to each other. It's the females, not the males, who leave the group at maturity. Not only that, the males will form coalitions to deal with out-of-group matters, but very, very few will form coalitions, strong coalitions to deal with in-group matters. The community can only get so large before genetic bonds between the males begin to get watered down. Animals living in massive, highly organized and coordinated colonies, they place extreme limits on reproduction, and you literally have this playing out in biological phenotypes, in the worker, soldier, drone, queen. They all have different bodies, and they all have different reproductive systems. But us, according to Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist who studies morality, one of the reasons we've been able to come up with this system, become the only species on Earth that does what we do the way we do it, is because of this. And not that specifically, but that phenomenon. Sacred objects. A sacred object doesn't necessarily have to be a god or a religion. It can be a principle or an ideal, a cause or a worldview. It can be right or wrong-headed in your opinion or mine. But the important thing is that it involves the sacralizing of an object in such a way as to create a group identity around it. And you can even see kinship bonds evoked in much of the language around such objects. For religion, we are all God's children. We are all brothers and sisters. That's exactly what that's saying. Feminism has its sisterhood. We have mother and fatherland to evoke feelings of patriotism. Organizations such as the military, they use the band of brothers, the brotherhood rhetoric, in order to augment their strict formal hierarchies, as well as sacred codes of honor. Because these objects create a sense of shared in-group identity and common purpose, they are a source of group belonging, and they are necessary for cooperation and coordination on the massive scale that humans actually are capable of. At the same time, these sacred objects and the group identities they evoke in us erect tribalistic boundaries around the group, and they cause deep feelings of enmity regarding outsiders who might question the sacred object or reject membership in the group. Kind of like this. If you're not a feminist, you're a bigot. There is no in-between. The downside of this sense of group belonging is that it seems to require the existence of an outgroup, or a challenge, external challenge, or an external adversary. That's why the movie Independence Day was so popular, because it harnessed all of those feelings. We could form a global community of human beings, but only when the aliens were attacking. 3 of the 4 basic conflicts in literary fiction are man against nature, and man against society, and those literary tropes appeal to us for a reason. Conflict drives us as humans, and you cannot convince people to read fiction without conflict. It's more important than plot, it's more important than prose, it's more important than character, it's more important than just about anything else. And how better to define the us than in opposition to the them? Liberals versus conservatives, Republicans versus Democrats, atheists versus creationists, the religious versus the devil, or human evil, or the infidel. Or feminists versus the cis-heteronormative, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. Which brings us to this, which is, yes, I never made a bad decision I wasn't willing to stick with. Imagine you have a hypothesis, and imagine you turned that hypothesis into an entire career, and during the course of that career, you managed to acquire a ton of status. People thought you were brilliant. They admire you. They pay you to speak. They see you as someone who should be listened to. You're an expert, right? They pay you a ton of money to teach other people this stuff that you know, that you're an expert in. It becomes your life's work. It is something you are famous for. Now imagine someone showing you a single piece of evidence that undermines the foundational premise of your hypothesis. What would you do? You've invested so much of your life, your time, your energy, your heart, your soul in this one set of ideas, all of it supported by something you always considered a given, but has now fallen under scrutiny and challenge. There's a reason that phrase appeals to people. but it's a lie. The sunken cost fallacy is about our reluctance to cut our losses once we've invested heavily in a given cause or action, even when there is substantial evidence that we're wrong or that we have put our money in what is essentially a junk bond. We would rather pour more money in to save the junk bond than admit we bought junk. I've already paid so much in. I can't abandon this idea now. In the late 1800s, a revolutionary named Ignaz Semmelweis discovered that implementing a program of doctors washing their hands in chlorinated lime could reduce childbed infection and death rates by up to 90%. When he had documented proof of this correlation, he went to his superiors with his findings, and what became of him? He was fired. And it was another 50 years of women dying after childbirth before doctors started washing their hands. The nervous excitation and 4 humorous theories of disease were the prevailing wisdom at the time. Germs had yet to be discovered, and Ignaz's findings didn't just demand a departure from common practices. They actually challenged the paradigm. It required a complete rethinking of how the medical establishment conceptualized disease. And he died friendless and impoverished in a mental institution about 2 weeks after he was committed, after he had made a lifelong nuisance of himself with his newfangled, novel, revolutionary idea about hand washing. And why was there so much resistance? Because it struck at the heart of everything. It struck at the foundation of the model the medical establishment was using. It cast into question all of their basic beliefs and assumptions, and that meant throwing everything away, all of it, the whole thing. The foundational belief of mainstream feminism rests on a belief in the historic oppression of women by a system of male dominance that confers unjust and unearned privileges on men. Its entire body of theory rests on this one presupposition, and they will protect it with everything that they have got. But the reality is that in every single metric we would use to demonstrate that blacks are disadvantaged compared to whites, and I've put a few of them up there, men fare more poorly than women, and in many of these metrics they have always fared more poorly than women. And in many of them, these gaps are much wider than the gaps between, say, blacks and whites in the US. Yet what do we hear from feminists regarding all of these inconvenient truths? They're byproducts of male privilege. Men still have all the real power within the system. Therefore, men could easily fix all of these problems if they just wanted to. And if they don't, it's on them. And that the root cause of these problems is the hatred and devaluation of women. Suicide is caused by the expectation of male stoicism, you see. Boys don't cry and all that. And why don't boys cry? Because crying is a woman thing, and women are hated and devalued in patriarchal societies. See, it's really all about misogyny. It couldn't possibly be because societies have always valued stoicism in men, because men who are stoic can better protect and provide for women and children or anything. It couldn't be that, because if that were the case, it would be very difficult to argue that women are hated or not valued by society. Male suicide couldn't possibly have anything to do with men routinely losing access to custody of their children after divorce. I mean, they do lose access, but that's misogyny too, don't you know? It's based on the assumption that women are only good for making and raising babies, even though feminist organizations fight every organized effort to change the situation. You see, it's really just misogyny. Couldn't have anything to do with negative assumptions about men as potential abusers or anything, even though those assumptions are entrenched in our laws and policies surrounding family violence at the behest of feminist organizations who wrote many of the policies and the laws. And even if those assumptions exist, it's because of patriarchy, even though feminist lobby groups have exploited these assumptions in their opposition to shared parenting legislation for decades. Do you see how it's exhausting? It must be exhausting. The aforementioned are the typical things that I come across, but the mental gymnastics involved, they're astounding. And the only reason anyone would engage in this kind of pretzelizing of reality, wherein suffering is defined as privilege, and privilege is defined as oppression, is to defend the basic premise that patriarchies privilege men and oppress women. Even without the psychological phenomena of belief perseverance, the sunken costs involved in the feminist endeavor make it next to impossible to shift the momentum. There is too much money and status to lose, too many careers and reputations at stake, and too much potential for embarrassment for the feminist establishment to even so much as consider that they maybe got something so fundamental just a little bit wrong. Can you imagine the level of embarrassment to actually have to admit that your entire life's work is just junk? They're in a position to maintain and promote the patriarchy narrative through media, education, social work, academia, government, and the law. And they will do so to save themselves from embarrassment, to maintain their revenue streams, to some of them because they actually believe it. And given the vagaries of human psychology and what's at stake, they will continue to do so for as long as the public is willing to buy it. And the public is willing to buy it because we humans are naturally gynocentric. We inherently believe women are deserving of our protection, and what feminists tell us only reinforces those feelings. And this brings me to men themselves and how they act as their own worst enemies, at which point I'm going to ask you to compare these images. You can see the male surrounded by the adoring females. He's got a very smug look on his face. He's quite pleased with himself. And the women really are just showering adoration down on him. And I'm not saying that Obama is having sex with any of these women, or that he signed the Lilly Ledbetter Act into law just to get laid. But all of these impulses that we have that help us get laid, they manifest themselves in every aspect of our lives. It's all kind of one big mishmash of survival and reproductive strategies. And our particular brand of egalitarian monogamy, this model that has allowed us to cooperate to this degree, that gives most men a shot at the brass ring of passing on their genes and having a mate for life, that's a relatively new adaptation. And evolution is not an inventor, it's a tinkerer. Humans don't get a total redesign on the factory floor every few generations. All the older stuff that we came from, that's all still there, the stuff up there. It's all still there underneath this new stuff. And what we used to do, how we used to do things, looks more like this. That is what powerful men do. Most of them. There are a few. There are a few who can see through it or who can get around it, or for some reason they don't buy into this. But powerful men, you know it, I know it, everybody knows it. The manifesto of the Conservative Party with its 23 areas of women's disadvantage that they were going to tackle in the last British election, right? And nothing for men. You know that's what these powerful men, they're just going along with it. We don't do things the way these sea lions do anymore, not in the Western world, but we did them that way for a lot longer than we have been engaging in this grand experiment in social and biological evolution that we call humanity. And the assumption that men in positions of power, alpha males, would privilege all men at the cost of women's oppression defies everything I know about biology, about other species, about the origins of our species, everything. Obama, an alpha male, signed a useless piece of legislation into law to resounding public approval, and yet somehow the proposal presented to him years ago for the creation of a much-needed White House Council on Boys and Men has been tabled. It was tabled essentially for 7 of his 8 years in office. It's just, they literally had a Boy Scout and the head guy in the Boy Scouts standing outside the door of the Oval Office. It was on the agenda. They were going to present him with this proposal. And it got scratched off the agenda, and it has gone down the memory hole, never to return. That is part of who we are as a species. And as much as we might wish it otherwise, this is just where we are. And it's also what puts the lie to the whole feminist model of patriarchy. But at the same time, it's what makes the myth of patriarchy so palatable to people. We're not on the African savannah anymore. The immediate and difficult environmental challenges that necessitated the voluntary investment and cooperation of all males in the success of everyone, those are gone. But the flow of resources is still one way from men to women and children. But because it's no longer voluntary, it no longer requires a reward. Women don't need to reward it, and high-status men don't need to reward it or enforce those rewards. And I understand that, if all of this really turns out to be the case, which I think it is, but I could be wrong, and I would love nothing more than to be wrong, I get how daunting this tangle of challenges is, and how it probably is. You're not very happy with me right now. But our approach to equality or even basic fairness is right now the equivalent of the bloodletting of Ignaz Semmelweis's era. How can we begin to solve the problems of men or women if we're unable to understand or unwilling to acknowledge what's causing them? Feminism's patriarchy theory is the four humors understanding of society. They have systematically bled society in the name of an unproven, unfalsifiable hypothesis that feels very comfortable but is completely bogus. And one of the most ironic reasons they have been able to do this is because they are taking age-old, biologically based intuitions and repackaging them as novel and revolutionary ideas. This is from the 16, maybe, hundreds. It's the men's movement that has been at the forefront of genuinely revolutionary ideas. People call us regressive and accuse us of wanting to turn back the clock to the heyday of the patriarchy, back when all the domestic violence shelters were for men, and it was illegal for women to sexually assault men or something. How were they able to do this? Convince people of this? Because we humans are just animals, after all. We're not perfect, divine beings. We do not hover over the filth and muck of biological reality. We are right there in it, and we are just a product of our evolutionary legacy. We love our narratives, and some narratives we love more than others because they feed our biases. Women are in danger, something must be done. Men are in danger, business as usual. Isn't that what they're for? And as much as I'd love to tell you there's a cure for all of this, I honestly don't think there is. But there is a treatment that might help, and as any doctor could tell you, the first step to successful treatment is admitting that you have a problem. Because this problem is a problem with all of us. Even most of you here, I would bet. And there is a lot of other waking up that needs to happen. There are actually 3 choices in this picture. Not 2, 3. You can take a red pill, you can take a blue one, or you don't have to take any pill at all. And a lot of people in society have chosen not to take either pill. They're just going along until something comes along to motivate them. And a lot of them see what's going on. They just don't care enough to stick their necks out. And that is probably the most difficult challenge of all. Thanks.